Yeah.
Because they're cheap. On there, yeah. it is probably helpful if most of you, or at least some of you, don't have a video feed, but I do need a few of you. So if you're in a good spot, you really want to show off the room you're in, it would be helpful if you could, if a few of you could turn on your video feed. Thank you, Daniel. I think the feed might be better, pretty well better this week. I got a relay to help the signal get to where I'm working, and if that doesn't work, there are other measures I could try to implement, but it would kind of require everyone to relearn how to do everything we're doing. Okay. Let the people that logged in exactly at 6 o'clock get in. Then I'll start talking at you.
Hey, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Have you heard that thing about how Native Americans wouldn't have seen like the ships of pilgrims when they came over? Is that a myth?
It's an interesting idea. Like, well, it's an interesting idea because it would tie in with Sapir Whorf hypothesis because they wouldn't have a way of processing what they were seeing.
Look at this guy's picture.
Hey, Jillian, you're on.
Oh, that's
There you go. Anyway, so they wouldn't understand what they were looking at. That's for sure. Now, whether like their eyes straight up didn't see it, we can't know. But it's an interesting idea. I think it's a more interesting hypothesis, especially if we're talking about the Aztecs, that they thought the Spanish were Quetzalcoatl, their white god, and that's how basically the Spaniards tricked them so far. But then once Montezuma figured that out, he killed a lot of them. Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, guys. Are there any issues with what we're doing right now? I am. My daughter is. Normally, she goes to this like pseudo school, pseudo daycare thing, but they're closed down because of potential infection there. So I have my kids with me all day, every day this week. So my efficiency isn't exactly what I want it to be. So I'm way behind on my emails. My goal for tomorrow is to get caught up on that. With that said, if anyone feels comfortable talking about any of this, if you had any issues, are there any issues, anything super big that can't wait till tomorrow? No? Okay. Yeah, I'm going to try to get that caught up fast. Yeah, and then to go on for the week, my agenda will be to get everything from last week graded and then work on the presentation for next Monday. I don't know if it is accessible to you right now because I only uploaded it about 20 minutes ago, but you should have access to the slides right now if uh, Learn actually did its job. With that said, Learn often doesn't do its job. And if it's not there right now for you to grab, under the slides section, you can grab it no later than tomorrow. Anyway, okay. Anything else before I go into, let's look at, I don't know if I'm going to show it to you on the share function, but I am going to look at your assignments for this week because I did shift stuff around a little bit. Just heard the first person to get kicked out today. As always, if you get kicked out, just kick yourself back in. Okay, so I loaded the quiz this morning. That is good to go. Remember, it's a 10-minute quiz, so be sure to study at least a little bit before it. Your short essay for the day. I'm going to share that stuff with you. So let me shift my stuff around first. And okay. So I shifted this assignment around this morning. So if you woke up first thing this morning to see what's this week's paper about, well, it's slightly different. I did this basically to give it a little bit more structure and to help you engage in the material that we're going to be talking about tonight. So here's your premise, because it is kind of building off last week's premise of the post-apocalyptic economy. This one is post-apocalyptic new society. So here's the background. The world as you know it has ended. You're one of a band of 200 survivors. Take note that you're supposed to, you don't have to necessarily linguistically like define it as in Webster Dictionary says blah, blah, blah. By the way, never say Webster's Dictionary anything. It's not a good writing tick. Don't do that. Anyway, so show me what band means, right? And I'm looking for you understand what each of these bolded words means. Anyway, you're one of a band of 200 survivors. You're well respected in the group, and people often turn to you when times come to hard decisions. Recently, there's been a string of difficult decisions that have made the group realize they need some kind of government. As a well-respected member of the group, write a proposal laying out the type of government you should have. In the proposal, address the following. Who should be in charge? How would you decide who is in charge? So what would the mechanisms for that be? And we're going to talk about a lot of ideas for that in today's lecture. You should get some ideas. What will it mean to be the group's designated leader or leaders? You could hypothetically have multiple designated leaders. Would your group classify as a direct democracy, a representative democracy, a dictatorship, a monarchy, or maybe something else? If you choose maybe something else, be sure to show me you understand these bolded terms. What rights will be granted to citizens, and how would an individual go about becoming a citizen? What does it mean to be a citizen? All that. And then one minor note here that I don't have in, I might write in after I'm done tonight, is that if you want to do a little bit of world building, saying what the apocalypse was, how many years it was, whatever, and you want to do a little bit of that creative stuff, that's fine. No more than 100 words worth of that, okay? So like, don't eat up all your words and then say, oh, by the way, we're blah, blah, blah. Don't do that. That's cheesy. the length is 500 to 1,000 words. I just put that 1,000 cap in there in case anyone really, really wants to write. If you really, really want to write 200 words on the setting, be sure to make up for that on the back end. Cool. Any questions on that? Your faces have now shifted up to my wall, so I'm looking at the ceiling. No? Okay. Yeah, it's the same general ideas as what you did last time. Just basically, I'm looking for you to, in essay way, show me what those terms that are bolded mean, and then maybe engage some with some other stuff in the course material. So let me change my screen sharing around just a little bit to make it less gross. Okay. Jeez Louise. Okay, do you guys see my PowerPoint presentation as it is right now? Okay, it's just, Zoom is just not built to work with PowerPoint. It's rather, well, it might be a bit of corporate shenanigans, you know. They wanted to get this license with Word or whatever, or Microsoft. Okay, almost ready to start yammering at you. And okay, so lecture 5.1. I'm still Jeremy E. Baker. So today, this agenda is this agenda is pretty severely out of whack. Sorry about that. So first we're going to talk about basic concepts. Then we will talk about politics, because that would be your second bullet point. Then we'll talk about types of government. Then we will talk about conditions of government. That's where it says change. And instead of talking about France, we're going to be talking about South Africa. I did everything for this presentation except update the agenda. I really thought, okay, government-wise, let's talk about the turmoil in France between 1750 and 1900, because if you know anything about French history, that century was like, it was wild in terms of the stuff that happened within France, particularly what happened in Paris. At one point, Paris set itself up as an anarchist free state that, like, it was really wild. But I got into that, and I was like, oh wow, I don't have the time to put into this, because entire courses can be taught about that. So I fell back on South Africa is what we're looking at, and South Africa and the apartheid government during South Africa, which is also thoroughly interesting and a smidge less confusing than the 4 revolutions that France had over the 1800s. So that's what we're going to do. And buckle up. This is going to be, well, this is certainly going to be a lecture. Anyway, basic concepts of government or politics. So we see the slide with the guy with the gun right now. Yep, okay, good. Okay, power. If we're going to talk about politics, we have to talk about power, because politics effectively is power. Power is the ability to compel others to do things that they would not choose to do of their own accord. Now, that can be as much as forcing people to do things they very much do not want to do, or it could be just gently convincing things, whatever. There's a lot of different ways to get power. Coercive power is power that is derived from force or the threat of force, right? So coercive power is that you don't do this, I'm going to shoot you, or I'm going to beat you up, or I'm just holding a gun, right? The implication of force, as it will, is also quite powerful. This guy is a armed security guard in New York City. I was just looking around for pictures of armed guards, not cops or anything, and I found this really wild website/ad for armed guards in New York City, and like it was like, so you want to be a supervillain henchman. It was really pretty something else. So this is what our real world supervillain henchmen look like. But this guy has coercive power, right? Quite frankly, if you haven't gathered up to this point, I, at a psychological level, have problems with authority. That's just kind of the nature of the person who I am. I'm not really all that jazzed about listening to any kind of security guard or whatever. But the reason I would listen to this dude is because he's holding an assault rifle, right? Like that's the coercive power. But with that said, coercive power is intensely weak, right? It's very weak. It is, as soon as the gun's removed, right? As soon as the threat of force is removed, you stop listening to that person, right? And if the person actually was holding a gun to you and then suddenly the gun goes away, you might attack that person. You might do the opposite of what that person does. You might never listen to them again. That's what that's all about. So yeah, now that I've said a couple sentences, how is the feed right now? Is it a little bit better than it was last time? Okay. We'll see.
Better.
Meh? Is that what I heard? Oh, no, or maybe you were just talking to someone else. Anyway, so that is power. This is authority. So authority is the ability to cause others to act. That's what, and there's something else happening behind. Anyway, authority is the ability to cause others to act. Authority can be said to be the permission to use power. That's another alternate definition of authority, is permission to use power. So authority may be based on characteristics such as honor, status, knowledge, ability, respect, holding formal public office. So all of those things give someone authority to do things. Your grandfather, if you like your grandfather, has a certain degree of authority because you listen to him, you trust him, because he's always been good to you. That is one type of authority. The authority police officers have is another type of authority. It should be noted regarding authority that those in authority may also wield coercive power. That's totally a thing, right? However, in democratic societies like ours, if there is evidence or a perception of too much use of force, as we currently see in conversations around police brutality, right? Then that authority can become diminished, right? If you perceive and you through your whole life has had nothing but respect for police, then you will have a different view than someone who's maybe had some negative experiences or heard negative stories or whatever, right? You'll have different approaches to authority. That's kind of what that looks like. Yeah. So then this whole beginning section is just basic concepts we need to talk about additional things. So governments typically divide people into two groups. There are citizens, who are usually, in most circumstances, the majority of people in the society, in the modern sense anyway. And then there are non-citizens, who are marginal members of society. Citizens, being a citizen comes with having a whole bunch of rights, a whole bunch of abilities to do things, right? There are a lot of things that go around with being a citizen. And if you grew up in the United States, you were born in the country, you've always been a citizen, you might not even know that difference, right? We'll talk about that difference in the following slides. Non-citizens, though, are those who do not have those rights, right? Immigrants to the United States, until they naturalize, they are non-citizens. British tourists, hypothetically, that visit New York City for a week or so, those are also non-citizens. Citizenship may be stripped of an individual based on the laws of a country, right? it could be that someone could be stripped of their citizenship. Stripping citizenship is exceptionally rare in the United States. Historically and to this day, it is exceptionally rare. However, there are conditions under which citizenship can be stripped from individuals. One of those, which is especially troubling, quite frankly, is if you are a member of a group that is listed as a, quote, subversive group, you may be stripped of your citizenship. I couldn't find the root of that because when I was putting together this presentation, I am pretty darn sure that is a stipulation within the Patriot Act. I think that's where that comes from, because I'm pretty sure, but I'm not sure exactly. An example of a subversive group would be a group like Al-Qaeda or the Nazi Party, or what, like a real super bad guy group, right? We're not talking like really any sort of political group. We're talking about real, not listening to the law at all bad guys. Here is this image ties into the fact that globally there are many countries where citizenship can be stripped from individuals in mass, and those are almost always very bad situations. In 1935, Jews in Germany were stripped of their German citizenship. That legally at that moment in time was horrendous, but it was a little bit easier given the laws in Germany, which we'll actually talk about in a second, how that became, I mean, it was the Holocaust, right? Everything was horrible, but it became a little more, that's the greatest understatement I've ever made. Anyway, well, look at this slide. I think it's this slide, actually. 1 second. Yeah, here it is. Here's the slide that I was alluding to. So different societies determine citizenship differently. This is one of those places that if you've only ever been in the United States and your main exposure to this kind of stuff as an American, you might only know the American way. American citizenship is determined by birth within the territory. In Latin, in legal terms, this is called jus soli, or of the soil, right? So you're born here, you're a citizen, and application for legal status. So if you're not born in the United States, but you come and you do the very long naturalization process, and we are accepting new citizens at the time, hypothetically, then you can become a citizen as a non-native born American. That historic mode is also followed in Mexico and Canada, because Mexico and Canada, the majority of the population are people who are descended from immigrants, just like the United States. However, in Europe, Asia, and many other places, not the whole world outside of North and South America, but a lot of places, citizenship is determined typically by ancestry. This is called jus sanguinis, or of the blood, right? So in most of Europe, if you are born the descendant of people who are native to that country, then you become a citizen. You can become a naturalized citizen in most other countries, in many European countries, many African countries, by a similar naturalization process as is present in the United States. However, it's just a different default mechanism, right? And most of us, most of the population, kind of by default, that's what works for these countries. Now, an interesting caveat is when, for example, a child born of German citizens is born in the United States, right? That person, until the age of 25, has dual citizenship because they were born within the territory of the United States, but they are born descendant of two German parents. They have dual citizenship. Probably a more common way in the United States is a child born to two British citizens of the UK. That's actually, I actually know a couple kids like that. Their parents are both British citizens, but they were born in the United States, so they have dual citizenship. Now, most of those cases, that's the case in Germany, I'm pretty sure it's the case in the UK, that those kids have until the age of 25 to apply fully for dual citizenship, or sometimes to pick one or the other. That might be the option too. But there are a fair number of kids that are dual citizens. Now, if a kid were coming from Mexico or another Latin American place, if parents came, but the child was born in the United States, that child's citizenship would be of the United States, because Mexico is a territory citizenship place, and so is the United States, which, yeah, creates its own ball of wax. So, what exactly does it mean to be a citizen? We're going to talk about three types of rights that citizens have. First, citizens have civil rights. So this is the right to vote, the right to a fair trial, the right to government services, the right to education, the right to use public facilities. These kinds of taking part in society or the civil life, these are commonly called civil rights. The civil rights movement was all about making it so that Black people, and specifically the civil rights movement was about Black people, but applied to other types of people. It made it so that Black people actually had civil rights, right, in reality. In the law as it existed, Black people did have these rights prior to the civil rights movement. However, the law and those rights were not in reality enacted fully, right? So that's kind of the backing behind that stuff. Political rights then, which are those that ensure that citizens can participate in the government or in politics, if you will. These are things such as voting and running for office and expressing your political opinion, right? You can't be punished for those things in the United States. That's part of your political rights if you are a citizen. Procedural fairness in the law, right? That's another one of your rights. A right to a fair trial. And so a fair trial, it's pretty self-explanatory. A right to due process. So the judicial process gives you the right to have your lawyer, the right to, speedy trial, all that stuff, everything that's in the Constitution. The right to legal remedy and freedom of association. You can talk to, you can hang out with whoever you want to, right? And as long as you guys aren't teaming up to break a law, that's totally allowed. Now, and really, I can't emphasize this enough, but if you're not a citizen, this doesn't apply to you, right? That's one of the things, that's one of the problems, right? So I've known immigrants that have been afraid of expressing political opinions because they might, someone might come after them. Now that's not really how the law is set up, but you're less legally protected if you are a non-citizen. So that isn't it's not an entirely unfounded fear, which is the short of it. It is, it's an issue. It's an issue. Oh, this note here, there isn't a super clear line between civil rights and political rights. One group will say these things are civil rights, one other group will say these things are civil rights, but between the two terms, civil rights and political rights, all these things are covered. Like, what is voting? Is it a civil right or a political right? It's kind of mushy, but it's one of the two. Anyway. Now, social and economic rights. These are a troubling matter. So these are governmental provisions of economic and social security. These are rights such as access to quality public services, access to education. And what does education mean, right? Access to health services, access to housing, access to employment, access, yeah, health services is on there, access to social rights for minority groups. These rights are not rights that are evenly distributed across the United States and are not properly codified. They certainly are in the Constitution, and they are a matter of the state to state by virtue of the 10th Amendment, which the 10th Amendment basically gives the states the right to make up this stuff on their own, right? This is something that is not in the Constitution, quite frankly. As by virtue of not being in the Constitution, by not being in federal law, it's not even evenly distributed across the country. It's an issue. This whole bit, access to health services, right? I certainly don't have health services that I would consider adequate, quite frankly. So this second Bill of Rights is something that has been discussed in politics in the United States since at least the 1920s. If you know your American history, this is a picture of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR, one of his major political agendas during his, I believe it was his third term in office, one of his major agendas was to get this second Bill of Rights put into the Constitution. However, he died before that actually was enacted, and it didn't have really the political heft that he wanted it to have. So it never actually happened. So we as Americans do not have a guarantee to these rights, like citizens in many of our European counterpart countries and citizens in some other countries also do not have. It's certainly an issue. Okay, so now let's talk about some basic political definitions. So, and these are certainly two images that you probably don't associate with politics. Politics are the methods and tactics of managing a nation or state, as well as administering and controlling its internal and external affairs. So politics are the ways that you get stuff done in a country, right? That's an adjacent definition, right? So, and a really critical thing I want you to understand, if we're talking about this in either sociological terms or anthropological terms, is that politics are not unique to democracy, right? Not every country determines how to deal with their stuff based on elections, right? Or the will of the majority of the people, right? That's how we do it in our country. North Korea does politics, and this is an image of Kim Jong-un in one of his propaganda pieces. They do their politics by convincing the masses or by convincing certain people in political parties that Kim Jong-un is all powerful. And the closer you can get to that, the center of that power, to Kim Jong-un, the more you can get things done the way you want to get them done. That is example of North Korean politics. Another really super interesting thing about this image in particular is that I think they messed up this camera angle. So I think they wanted this image of Kim Jong-un with these like hysterical looking young women who were so adoring. I think they wanted it more to be in front of this set of bleachers, right? Because if it were more in front of the bleachers, it would make it look like there were so many more. And if you see this picture closer, these are all women, right? If it was all filled with these pictures of women, it would be kind of a more powerful image. But because of this camera angle, we can see that it's just kind of a bleachers full of ladies. It's pretty interesting. The posing and the camera angles of a place like North Korea it's truly propaganda. It's pretty interesting. This is a picture of the signing of the Magna Carta. If you don't know your ancient European history all that much, the Magna Carta was a document that was signed by kings and nobility agreeing that basically the king does not have absolute power, right? And in doing that, the king, and in this, the Magna Carta, I think, was signed in 1144, somewhere around there, I think. So they're agreeing, okay, we kings aren't all powerful. We can't just do whatever we want. And why would they possibly do that? Well, they did it for political reasons. They did it so that because there was a string of very bad kings during that era too, and they did it so that their nobility would continue to listen to them, right? It's political maneuvering. It has nothing, these two images have nothing to do with who's going to get the votes. It has nothing to do with elections or anything like that. It has to do with the politics within their society. Okay. So, political ideology. This is an interesting concept because, again, we're used to certain ideas about what ideology is and maybe talking about Democrats and Republicans, but the reality of the matter is that ideology can be super, super big or it can be super, super small. So political ideology are the shared beliefs and values that legitimize the distribution and use of power in a particular society or a particular group. And this includes both beliefs of political parties and also the political beliefs of the society as a whole, right? So the Democrats, the Republicans, each of them have their own political ideologies, sure, but Americans, as divided as we are as a country, we do share a certain set of political ideologies, right? So first example is that Republicans tend to oppose raising taxes because they oppose perceived government waste, right? That is the political ideology of the Republican Party. And then we'll talk about Republicans and Democrats in a bit. And then though, example two, Democrats tend to favor raising taxes to pay for social services and those types of programs, right? That is part of their political ideology. And that's those two first examples, that's what we often think of as political ideology in the United States, because we do think of the country as being divided between Democrats and Republicans. But example three is a political ideology that we all share, nearly all of us. All Americans believe we should elect our leaders, right? That is a political ideology. That's something we all agree on. We certainly don't agree on who we should elect, but we do agree that we should elect somebody, right? Majority rules, all that nonsense. Other than, well, it depends on how it goes down. Anyway, example four is what you would find in a communist country, right? Communists believe that wealth of the super rich should be redistributed to the poor and the working classes. It should be taken from them and the rich should be gotten rid of, right? That is not an ideology that is, to say the least, super popular in the United States, but it is a belief that would be believed by the vast majority of people. It's certainly in North Korea. Well, now it's hard to tell what people believe in North Korea. In the Soviet Union, under the Soviets, that's something everyone would agree to, whether they like the government or not. It's just something the society believes in. Does that all make sense? Yeah, okay, cool. So, political organization. So this was political ideology. Here's political organization. Political organization are the patterned ways in which politics are used in society, right? And each society does this a little bit different, basically tailor-made to their society. These are not universal truths. What is the universal truth is that every society has political organization. So for example, in the United States, we are organized as a representative democracy with two political parties. We have a bicameral legislature. So we have two houses in Congress on the federal level that work with an executive, the president. And we also, I forgot, I'll put that there. We also work with the Supreme Court. And in that three-way division of powers, that is how we are organized. Many of our counterparts in the world are not structured that way. That's not to say that our way is the best. It's not to say our way, it's just different, quite frankly. What else? Yeah, many of our counterparts have parliamentary governments that we don't have. So yeah, that's, I almost just inserted something else entirely. Okay. There are third parties in the United States, right? There are third parties. There's the Green Party. There's the Libertarian Party. There is the Natural Law Party, which is intriguing. There is there are a whole bunch of different parties out there, and a lot of those parties are super regional too. Like there are parties, for example, in Iowa that we just don't have here in Ohio because a lot of third parties are super small. Many of our counterparts around the world have more than 2 viable parties, right? It's not just a 2-party system. For example, in the United Kingdom, let's see if I can remember it, there are the Tories, there is Labour, and there is, I think they call themselves the Liberal Democrats, if I remember correctly. And between those 3 parties, the Tories and Labour are bigger, but the Liberal Democrats are also pretty darn big, right? So they have to deal with them in a way that is like for real. They actually politically really have to deal with them. In Congress, there is not any sort of representation of third parties. There is not a libertarian bloc. There is not a Green Party bloc of people in Congress. So the Democrats and Republicans, they don't have to deal with them. They just have to deal with all the different many versions of Democrats and Republicans, which is a feat in and of itself. It's just a different mechanic. Yeah, so the UK, Germany, and France, they both have much more involved and intricate party systems. Some countries only have one viable party. China only has the Communist Party, and that's it. There are, contrary to popular belief, in China, there are other parties, and some of those parties aren't illegal, right? But there are more than one party. Russia is a really intriguing case, and I nerded out on you with Russia last class, but Russia in the Soviet era, the only party was the Communist Party. In the post-Soviet era, let's see if I can remember the name of it. It's something like the National Constitution Party, something like that. Whatever it is, it's Vladimir Putin's party. Vladimir Putin's party has the vast majority of offices within Russia. They're massively overwhelm any other parties. And this is an interesting tidbit. The second largest party in Russia today is the Communist Party. There still is a fair number of communists in Russia that think, maybe we should go back to that way. Like, it's not gone. It's not fringe the way communists are, say, in the United States. And then certainly North Korea also is a place with only one viable party. That's pretty obvious. So the 2-party system now, and in most of this lecture, it all should have probably this abbreviation very simplified, right? But I'm simplifying a whole lot here. Anyway, though, the social dynamic regarding politics in the United States, and I used a double ellipses, is certainly interesting, right? It's a really weird thing because politics are a very, very important part of our social life, right? Super important. We sometimes don't like to admit it, but we base a lot of friendships on politics, right? We sometimes pick the churches we go to based on politics, right? It's the media we consume, all of that. It all has twinges of politics in there, right? But we don't talk about it. We don't talk, and if we do talk about it,
Spanish, what? It said thank you.
Okay, anyway, sorry, Luke. We don't talk about it. It's rude, right? That's what we call folkway. Folkways are rules that we follow so as not to be rude, right? Manners and folkways are basically the same thing. And our folkway tells us, don't talk about politics unless you know that that person is probably going to agree with you. It's a pretty interesting thing. A similar attitude also applies to religion, right? So in religion, we often don't talk about religion unless we open up the forum. Like, actually, that's part of what we do in classes like this, right? We kind of open it so we can break down those barriers a little bit, at least to address it, right? Thus, what's the point of this slide? The point of this slide is this thus, and so if you're writing along or underline this bit, some of us know a whole lot about politics. Some of us do, right? And really I should be saying some of you. Some of you do, but some of you probably don't, right? Some of you might not know very much about politics, and that's okay because we failed you as a society, right? We don't teach kids about politics in high school because high school teachers are afraid to get yelled at and to get fired by wacky parents or whatever. I'm not afraid of that because the college system is different and I don't have to deal with that kind of stuff, right? So if you don't know much about politics, I'm about to share some of that stuff that you were never really officially told. That's kind of the objective of this. This is not me trying to politically indoctrinate you or anything. I'm just laying out the facts. And for some of you, warning, it's probably dead obvious and you know all this shit already. That's fine. So, start off from raw basics. There are two major political parties in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats. Republicans and Democrats, right? Those are the two major political parties. However, and this is super duper interesting, says the sociologist, in 2018, and 2018 is really the year that we have the most recent information as, because we kind of gather this information as part of the election, right? So we can only really have these demographics after every election. In 2018, 42% of Americans identified with being independent, right? 30% of Americans identified with being Democrats, and 26% of Americans identified as being Republicans. Interesting. Now, and if you, here's my citation right there. If you want to know more about this stuff, I pulled these statistics and I pulled this chart from Gallup. Gallup is a super duper good statistics place. Anyway, Gallup. And in recent years, so the cutoff was really at 2008, but this independent thing is not new, right? It goes at least back to 1988. That there is a really significant chunk, 42% of the population identify as being politically independent. Really super interesting. We'll stay on, we'll come back to that. Wait, let me just make sure we'll come back to that. Yeah, we'll come back to that. But let's talk about these two other parties too, right? And then we'll talk about what exactly those independents mean. We're going to talk about the culture of the Republican Party, right? What do Republicans believe? What are their names for themselves, whatever? The Republican Party's common abbreviation is the GOP. Why is it called GOP? Who knows? You were never taught that, maybe. It stands for Grand Old Party. That's kind of an older name for the party. It really harkens back to about the 30s or 40s, but they stick with that name. Republicans are conservative, right? So when we're talking about liberals and conservatives, conservatives are Republicans. And this, I'm really not talking down to you guys. My dad doesn't know most of this. He's completely politically illiterate. Anyway, Republicans are right-wing, right? When we talk about right-wing and left-wing, Republicans are right-wing. And why we call it right and left, that actually goes back to the parliamentary system in Europe, and it's not worth going over. They're just right, whatever. Other right-wing groups that are not Republicans include libertarians, the Constitution Party, and also fascists and the alt-right. Now, with that said, it is completely uncool to accuse a Republican of being a fascist because it's just different. It's just different thing, right? Fascism is a really horrible ideology. It's not the same thing as republicanism. It's different. We'll talk about what it is in a second. But the alt-right, though, they are fascists. Don't question that for a second. Current symbols of the Republican Party, this kind of stylized elephant is a Republican symbol. And then over the last couple years, the Make America Great Again hats, those have kind of come to be known with the Republican Party. The hat thing, that kind of thing, almost the merch of it, that ebbs and flows. That comes and goes. Like, for example, the last recent, Biden doesn't really have that kind of symbol game on. Obama did. The Obama O, right? That is a real common going symbol of the Democratic Party, even though Obama hasn't been in office for 4 years, right? And then we have the stylized donkey as being a symbol for the Democratic Party. So, common abbreviations for the Democratic Party, the DNC. Now, that's actually technically not super accurate, right? So basically, the GOP, they had their 3-letter abbreviation, and then the Democrats had to come up with something, so they called themselves the DNC. Now, the Democratic National Committee is actually the group that oversees the Democratic Party. It's not the same thing. The DNC is actually the body that the committees that oversee the Democratic Party. But that's beside the point. Democrats can be called liberal. They can also be called conservative, right? Now, you can write books on the definition of what liberal means, and I misspoke there. Democrats are also, they're called progressive. They're not called conservative. If someone calls a Democrat conservative, they're talking about something else entirely. Anyway, the reason why, though, Democrats began to be called progressive was that in the 1990s, Newt Gingrich, who was a pretty predominant Republican and actually a pretty brilliant political mind, he started to work on this political rhetoric of liberals are horrible, because he wanted to basically defeat the Democratic Party. So eventually, around 2000 or so is when it took off. The Democrats started calling themselves progressive. And that's kind of held on, and they do probably call themselves progressive more often than not. But you will definitely hear Democrats be called liberal now and then. Now, Republicans are right-wing, Democrats are left-wing. Other left-wing groups that are not Democrats include the Green Party. Communists are also left-wing, right? Similar point I made about Republicans and fascists. It doesn't make sense to call Democrats and the Democratic Party communists. It's not the same thing, right? And to make those grand statements honestly makes you, if you were making the person making the point with those grand hyperbolic statements, it makes you look dumb, quite frankly. And I don't want my students to look not eloquent, right? I'm all about giving my students the tools they need to have nuance, I think. So communists, anarchists are leftists who are not Democrats. Anarchists are actually a group that would be likely to also call Democrats liberal in kind of an insulting way. Again, that's a long story. And then anti-fascists as well. There's a common misconception, actually, that anti-fascists are really a unified thing in modern society. Really, what keeps the anti-fascist movement going is a belief that fascists are bad, right? There isn't like a party platform of what it means to be anti-fascist, for example. With that said, many anti-fascists are anarchists, but not all of them. I probably should have put in some more about what anarchy exactly is. If you're super curious, like, you can send me an email. Okay, so what do these two groups believe? Because again, if this isn't something that interests you, you might not know this stuff. Well, what do Republicans believe? Republicans believe that abortion should not be allowed. They call that being pro-life. Democrats then believe that abortion is a personal choice, and they call that being pro-choice. Now, with that, all of these said, right, in the United States, there are millions of Republicans and millions of Democrats, right? With all those millions of people, there are certainly Republicans that would classify as being pro-choice. There are certainly Democrats that would classify as being pro-life. And that goes for each of these points. And these are just small, the most commonly discussed things that are discussed in politics, and these are the big ones. There's others certainly very important things. Firearms should not be regulated. That's something Republicans tend to believe. Firearms should be regulated. That's something that Democrats tend to believe, right? Taxes should be avoided because that's something Republicans believe. Taxes are needed to fund social services, right? Taxes are needed for things. That's something Democrats say. I missed one here. Environmental regulations are harmful to business. That's something Republicans say. Something Democrats say. Environmental regulations are needed to prevent climate change, right? Climate change has been very politicized in a way that's kind of dangerous in our society, similar to how COVID has been politicized. And the reason for that is that we are in the default mode of turning our national issues into political things, right? And that's deeply troubling. It makes it hard to do things like stop a major outbreak. Police departments deserve our respect. That tends to be a Republican stance. Police departments must be reformed to protect minority populations. That's something Democrats would be more likely to say. But look at that. Just consider that one right there. Does everything have to be one or the other, right? Can't we have police who are respected, but also protect minority populations, right? That's part of what I'm talking. Like maybe some of these things don't need to be either or too. These are dilemmas. Republicans tend to believe that immigration should be restricted. Democrats tend to believe that the immigration system should be reformed to make sense and to help people. And these are, again, as I mentioned, these are just some examples too. If you haven't ever really learned anything formal about politics as they exist in the United States, maybe now you know just a little bit. So now this is interesting. What do independents believe, right? The answer I answer with my double ellipses is it's really hard to say, right? There is no centralized independent party. There simply isn't. There have been groups over history that have called themselves the independent party, but those groups never maintain and never last. The last major push for the independent party was Ross Perot's presidential election. I believe that was in 1994. But there is no centralized independent party. And it is more of a category of neither Republican nor Democrat, right? And it could also include third parties, right? So when we do our polls as a nation, there's a lot of polling going on right now. We only have a couple weeks till an election. And the first day to vote, I believe, is October 1st in the state of Ohio. So get that all lined up if you do intend to vote early. But our pollsters tend to ask, are you voting for the Democratic candidate, or are you voting for the Republican candidate? And within most answers to those questions, and this is actually pulled from today, right? This is exactly what the pollsters said today. 52.9% plan on voting for Biden, and 45.8% plan on voting for Trump. That equals 98.6%. So 1.4% of the population is not voting for Trump nor Biden, right? If we had a truly, fully, thoroughly independent thing in this country, it would be a whole lot bigger than 1.4%, right? So there's a couple different phenomena that could be happening here. One thing that could be happening is, and it's probably the most likely thing that's happening, is that a lot of people don't like either of the two parties. That's for sure, right? But, so that's part one. But part two is most people that classify themselves and call themselves independent definitely have a preference for either Republicans or Democrats, right? So they definitely have a preference there. It's like, no, I am not a member of the Democratic Party, but I sure like what Bernie Sanders had to say, for example, right? I don't like that mainstream Democrat thing. I'm going for Bernie Sanders. Or someone saying something like, I really can't stand Trump, but I'm a Republican and I don't like Biden, so I guess I'm voting for him, right? A lot of that kind of nuanced stuff, right? Are you guys still there? Okay, yeah, you're still, I'm looking at blinks. Okay, we're still there. Okay, so that's really what a lot of that comes down to. We're forced into making this bifurcated choice, right? So, and a lot of us, I can probably include myself, I don't like really, I'm not in love with either party, right? But I definitely have my personal preferences, right? And then, but also included in that independent block, clump, whatever, are also all of those other people who would classify as being third party, right? Because our pollsters don't ask, do you consider yourself to be a member of the Green Party? Do you consider yourself to be a member of the Libertarian Party? Do you consider yourself to be a member of the Natural Law Party or the Purple Party or whatever, right? So yeah. The short of this, all of this is there's a lot of independence in this country, and it's really hard to tell what exactly that means. Very interesting things as far as sociology goes. It's not really the kind of thing anthropologists study, but it's definitely a thing sociologists study. Anyway, let's look into types of government now that we've looked at kind of those basics. And now we're going more into the macro scale, the big global picture scale, not so much the United States anymore. Government. Haven't really defined government yet. So government is an interrelated set of status roles that become separated from other aspects of social organization, such as kinship in exercising control over a population. So most people's moms and dads and who their moms and dads are don't really make a difference in terms of how government works. And even if you're living in a monarchy, there's only really one family that makes a difference, and that's the royal family, right? Most of it is separate from familial matters, right? A major role in government, and you could argue the major role in government, is determining laws. Laws we're defining as a formal norm that has been codified. It's been written down. It's been agreed upon in one way or the other. A norm, as thrown at you in this definition, a norm is a rule in society that are expected to be followed. Norms can be either formal or informal. So, and we talked about the folk way of it being kind of rude to talk about politics in mixed company. A folk way is a loose norm, and then a law is typically a more firmly agreed upon norm. Now, how laws come into place can vary from society to society. This is a statue, an image of Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar was the first emperor of Rome and certainly one of the more brilliant emperors of Rome. But the way he passed laws was he made decrees, right? And that's how most that's not how all laws in Rome were passed, but it's how most laws were passed. That's not how it works in the United States. There are no, the president, as powerful as he thinks he is, cannot just make decrees like the Roman emperor could make decrees. You have to work with Congress, and certainly the president can make suggestions, and certainly presidents can make presidential, what's that called? Anyway, it's, you know, those presidential things. I'm sorry, my brain's skipping the word. But they have to work with Congress, right, to make the law full. So that's what government is. So the rest of this is working from the smallest form of governments up to the bigger forms of government and then different versions of big forms of government. The smallest form of government that you can classify as being government is a band. A band is a small group of people related by blood or marriage who live together and are loosely associated with a territory in which they forage, or they hunt, or they be pastoral, or whatever, right? A tribe then is the next step up from a band. A tribe is a culturally distinct population whose members consider themselves descended from the same ancestor or ancestors. That's really the unifying definition of tribe. Now, depending on circumstance, the tribe may be synonymous with the term ethnicity. We're going to talk more about ethnicity when we talk about race and ethnicity. That's coming in a couple weeks. But it should also be noted when talking about tribe that there are certain tribes, there are certainly cultural connotations to American Indians and the term tribe. It can be applied to talk about different ethnicities, but certainly in the United States, when you talk about who a tribe is or who a tribe isn't, it's most commonly referring to the indigenous peoples within the United States. Here's an example. This group lives together. They are a band. So these people are a band. Probably these people over here in the background, I don't think they're of the same band, but they are all Yanomami. Yanomami are a tribal people. They are a tribe, an ethnicity that lives in the more remote areas of the Amazon rainforest. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah, okay, good. Oh, wrong way. A chiefdom then is the next biggest thing. A chiefdom is a society with social ranking in which political integration is achieved through an office of centralized leadership called a chief, right? So if chiefdom is typically a tribe that has picked one leader, right? So a tribe may be made up of many bands, and then that tribe that is made up of bands is governed by a chiefdom, like a kingdom, right? But a kingdom has a king, right? A princedom has a prince. A duchy has a duke. Anyway, the society may have a different name for their chief. It really depends on the language, right? Different societies have different names for their leaders, but anthropologists would call that a chief. Here is an image of Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Nation. He was best known for his leadership during the Nez Perce War, and that was one of the last acts of resistance during the series of conflicts that happened about 50 years during the Indian Wars. What Chief Joseph did was U.S. government was trying to force the Nez Perce onto a reservation that first of all, wasn't their homeland, but second of all, was really bad land. It was just not good for anything. Chief Joseph and the rest of the Nez Perce refused, and over the course of that, he led, it's sometimes known as Chief Joseph's War, where he attempted, they fled several hundred miles up toward Canada and he was a very smart man. He wasn't someone that didn't know international politics. And this is in the late 1800s, so he was pretty damn educated too. He was attempting to flee with all his people over into the Canadian border to apply for amnesty as refugees and to be taken in by another tribe that is culturally very similar to the Nez Perce. He didn't make it. They were defeated. But in that act of defiance, Chief Joseph became very deeply respected both by the U.S. military and by kind of popularly in the United States during that era. That might have gained them a little bit more leverage in negotiating actually going onto the reservation. But yeah, Chief Joseph certainly is one of the prominent chiefs of that era. A state then. Okay, so here we are into more modern structures, at least in terms of what we typically think of in terms of government. A state is defined as a hierarchical, centralized form of political organization in which there is a centralized government, right? There's a super common error that we make in the United States to think of a state as being one of these entities like Ohio or Pennsylvania or West Virginia. Yes, we call these states, but Canada is also a state. Germany is also a state. Australia is also a state. On the international scales, state is synonymous with country. That actually speaks to kind of what the founding fathers were getting at in the United States in our wording, because in the original Constitution, well, actually in the Articles of Confederacy, that's beside the point, we were, in our name as a country, we were supposed to be basically a coalition of independent small countries. That was the original version, but then we kept the name state to refer to entities like Ohio. In Canada, for example, they call those provinces. In France, they call them provinces. In Mexico, they also call them states. But actually, fun fact, in Mexico and in Spanish, it actually is the United States of Mexico too. That's their name for themselves in Spanish. What else? The state has a legal monopoly over the use of force, right? So in other words, the only people in a state who are allowed to use force are the military or the police. Those are the only two groups that are permitted to use force without getting into some trouble. And even the police and the military, they still can get in trouble for using force, but they're the only ones with that authority that we talked about earlier in the lecture. Now, a nation. This is a very similar concept, but it's a different thing. A nation is a group of people with a common language, common foodways, common culture. Interesting. It should be noted that the concept of nation and ethnicity are very similar. Those are similar concepts. And both of those can be similar to a tribe, but it has to be a super specific circumstance. Okay, now I'm getting to the point on the next slide. Why are we even talking about nations and states? Because we have to talk about nation states, right? A nation state is a sovereign, geographically based state that identifies itself as having a distinctive national culture and historic experience, right? Here we have, and here's my caption up here. Here we have a map of Europe during the 1500s. And if you're familiar with Europe, this map looks very different because especially we see this phenomena in where we know Germany to be. We see a bunch of little pieces, right? And over here, we have this country called Habsburg that no one's certainly heard of, right? And we have all of these other bits and pieces and baubles that are not countries as we know them. Then over the course of the 1600s, 1700s, and really the 1800s, these kingdoms went from being kingdoms that were just told what to do because that's what the king says and what the king's family says, right? Because in that era, nationhood was all about identifying with the king. In the 1800s, nationhood began to be tied with us that live in this country as a people, right? So all of these little kingdoms came together to become the German people. And then these kingdoms down here became Italy. And then Muscovy combined with Slovenia to become Russia, right? All of these things, right? That's why the maps are different looking. Many of our concepts, this is pretty interesting, historically anyway, many of our concepts of American national identity and what it means to be American, it means hot dogs and apple pies and the 4th of July and setting off fireworks and all that stuff, were built during the 1800s, right? A lot of those real super iconic things were built during the 1800s, our national identity. And a lot of that is tied with white national identity too. We talk about hot dogs, which are effectively white people food, right? They're sausages that are really Frankfurters, right? Which are really from Germany, but there were a lot of German immigrants eating those things. And then they changed the name of the thing during World War I because we didn't want to call them Frankfurters anymore. Screw the Germans, we're fighting a war against them. Let's call them hot dogs, right? And our national identity changed over time. And certainly these concepts of what it means to be American, they will also change over time. And they are changing over time. Very interesting things indeed. So moving on. Does that make sense? Are there any questions there? No? Good, okay, thanks for the thumbs up. Those emoticons or whatever the hell they are pretty nice. Good, Ava also has a thumb, good job. Okay, authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is a system of government by and for a small number of elites that does not include representation of ordinary citizens. Let me just do a thing real quick. I haven't seen the record. Okay, I just wanted to look to make sure I was still recording. So, authoritarianism is a system of government by and for a small number of elites that does not include representation of ordinary citizens. So, and regardless of how you feel we are doing as a country, we are not living in an authoritarian regime because we are still living in democracy. Now, will we always be living in a democracy? Will we be in a democracy 100 years from now? Who's to say, right? But now, today, we are in democracy. However, with that said, authoritarianism is very common in human history, but it is much less common in the modern day. An important thing to understand about authoritarianism is that it is not dependent on political ideology, right? So it's about tactics. It's about the fact that there's one person in charge or a small group of people in charge, and that person is going to tell everyone else what to do. That's what it means to be authoritarian, right? So, and we'll talk about this in a few slides, both communists and fascists, when they are in full power, both tend to be authoritarian, right? And ideologically, communists and fascists are very, very politically, ideologically different. Now, one form of authoritarianism is a dictatorship, and a dictatorship is probably one of the more common versions of authoritarianism. A dictator does not typically gain power by being elected or through secession, but through seizing power to become a ruler, right? And dictators typically come to power in a moment of crisis, right? So there's someone who's assassinated, and then the dictator takes his military might and says, I will be in charge now. I'll be the dictator. I will save us from this moment in time. Hitler did something very similar to that, and so did Julius Caesar here. Caesar kind of took the momentum and said, this country is falling apart. I'm the only one that can lead us against these barbarians, etc. I'm going to be the dude in charge. And dictators do also tend to be the first step into a very different form of government. Some of the more notable dictators often set up monarchies to come in after them. Caesar was dictator for a while, but then he became emperor. And then after Caesar, there were hundreds of years of emperors in Rome. But before Caesar, they were a republic, just like us. Not exactly like us, but pretty damn similar to us, which history tells us then that as much as we like the government of the United States and that we vote for things, that it is possible we could become a dictatorship one day. That is within the realm of possibility. And as people that think that democracy is good, that's something we all need to be aware of. Now, totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is the most extreme and modern form of authoritarianism, right? In which government seeks to control every aspect of citizens' lives. So, and totalitarianism is only made possible by technology. It was not possible prior to the modern era to try to control what people think, right? Or try to control what political meetings they go to, right? That only became possible in the 1920s and 30s. So here we have Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler. All three of these individuals were totalitarian dictators, right? They were all authoritarians. But Joseph Stalin was a communist. Adolf Hitler was a fascist. Mussolini was also a fascist, but a different kind of fascist than Hitler, right? And Mussolini and Hitler were allies, but especially Stalin and Hitler, very, very different in terms of political ideology. And totalitarianism, just like authoritarianism, is not dependent on political ideology. Totalitarianism is something that we need to be ever vigilant about as, again, people that think democracy is good. Because as our technology, as we become more dependent on technology, the capacity of a totalitarian regime to stifle free speech, to stifle democracy, becomes more and more present. And this is an interesting example because I was actually teaching this to my sociology class a couple weeks ago and something happened. So I said to them that, for example, if we truly lived in a totalitarian regime and I started teaching you this stuff, right, about different kinds of democracies and what you could do to change this and that and this and that, then they could, with our level of technology that we have in our society, send a drone out of the sky because they would be monitoring this class and blow up my house. They could do that. They really could, right? And then, though, 2 weeks ago, as soon as I said that, my feed died and I was cut out, which, like, it really made my point quite well. It was pretty funny because that's what would happen. It would just go, boom, right? And that's why we have to be aware of these things, because that is the danger of technology. But I think tech's great, don't get me wrong. So a monarchy is something else. A monarchy certainly can be authoritarian, but it's different than totalitarianism. A monarchy is a government by a king or a queen with succession of rulers that is kept within one family typically. Now, monarchies do sometimes change families. They call those dynasties. And sometimes one dynasty can replace another dynasty, but in a really long-going monarchy, that only happens every couple hundred years or so. Let me take a drink of water. There are two types of monarchies. There are absolute monarchies and constitutional monarchies. Absolute monarchies typically have complete authority over their subjects, right? An absolute monarch and absolute monarchies can effectively do whatever they want, right? So Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, he is the crowned prince of Saudi Arabia. They don't have kings, they have crowned princes. So he is the guy that is the absolute monarch over Saudi Arabia. If you've never really considered it, consider that this dude's last name is Saud of Saudi Arabia. Yeah, the country is named after the House of Saud. That's the monarchy built into the country itself, right? They don't just call it Saudi Arabia for nothing. It's about the Sauds. Actually, al in Arabic means the, so his name is the Saud. So he's an absolute monarch. Now, Al-Saud simply can't just say, okay, that guy over there, I don't like him, he's dead, right? That is not really super politically popular. Now, with that said, one of the members of the House of Saud a couple years ago did have a journalist assassinated because he didn't like what he was saying. And because of that, the Saudi government, and that prince in particular, has been dealing with those ramifications in getting what he wants politically done for the last couple years. So there certainly are political ramifications within absolute monarchies, even though it is within their power to do that kind of stuff, right? Now, a constitutional monarch then are royal figures whose powers are defined by a political charter and limited by a parliament or other governing body. So a constitutional monarch is actually relatively similar to our president, except they are not determined by votes, they are determined by lineage and the same kind of dynasty system that they have built into that. Fun fact, George Washington was actually offered by the Continental Congress to become the King of the United States. And then George Washington said to them in so many words, what the hell are you thinking, right? We just fought a war to get rid of the king, and now you want me to be king, right? So he said no, right? But we could have very easily had a king of the United States. That actually happened in France that I declined to talk about for hours this evening. They actually had a king and then an emperor after their grand revolution where they got a parliament, right? So they opted for a constitutional monarchy for a while. They have a president now, though. So here is a president of Karl V Gustav. He is the constitutional monarch of the Kingdom of Sweden. So Swedes are actually, they live in a kingdom. Now it comes up because we are closely tied to the UK and the United States. But what about the Queen of England? The Queen of England is an interesting character because she's barely a queen. She's really barely a queen. She has very, very little power in terms of being a monarch. All she really is the head of state. So she's the person that goes and shakes hands and visits people and gives a address every year. They do it on Christmas instead of the State of the Union that the president does in January. The Queen does her national address on Christmas Day. Yeah, so that's how that goes down. But the Queen of England, England is barely a constitutional monarchy. It really is better classified as a parliamentary democracy. Anyway, so a democracy. This is the thing we are in. So within a democracy, citizens are able to participate directly or indirectly in their own governance. A direct example of participating in governance is, say, going to a protest and holding a sign. That is direct participation. Or running for political office and being part of the government itself. That is direct participation. Indirect participation is voting, right? Because we live in a representative democracy, so we vote for our representatives and then they do those things. So democracy is the principal form throughout the world, although there are certainly some democracies that exist that are disenfranchised, right? You can have a long conversation over whether we in the United States are now disenfranchised by the electoral college system. You can make a pretty reasonable argument there, but we are not disenfranchised to the point where the Russian people are in today, that the only quote unquote choice they've had is Vladimir Putin since the year 2000. That is a better example of being disenfranchised. So I talked about representative democracy. That's what we live in which elect officials are expected to reflect interests of constituents. So here in Columbus, and probably where you are, if you're anywhere in central Ohio, our senator on the national level is Sherrod Brown, and he is our representative there in Congress, in the Senate. Now, the direct democracy is most famous for being the democracy of the city-states in ancient Greece. That's the direct democracy we most typically think of. Now, that's a really common misnomer because look at that definition, full participation of citizens. So in Athens, for example, in Athens, Greece, if you were a citizen, you had the right and the duty to go to these meetings and vote on what was actually going on. But what entailed a citizen was very different than what entails a citizen in our society. In Greece, to be a citizen, you had to be a land-owning, head of household male who had done military service. That's what it meant to be a citizen then, right? And in Athens, citizens then were only 3% of their total population, right? 3%, very different thing. So direct democracies really weren't a thing in ancient Greece. The closest probably we got to direct democracy, at least in the United States, were the very isolated settlements in New England during the colonial period, where when we were still part of Britain, but what actually happened in London had almost no consequence to us. And as a result, these little settlements basically had to vote on everything, and everyone went to the meetings and everyone went to vote. And by all of the accounts, they were very long, arduous processes, but they really did believe in this idea of democracy and everyone having a say. Yeah. So, and I've been parts of, and I'm not saying direct democracy isn't interesting and a fun idea. I've been parts of groups that have tried to be directly democratic. It's pretty tiring to get everyone to agree on something and then voting on something. Anyway, though, fascism. Fascism is a militaristic ideology that stresses the right of the powerful to rule the world. It's possibly the most ugly idea in modern society. Fascist governments are by definition authoritarian. There's no such thing as a democratic fascist, right? Fascism stresses power via military conquest. So what makes a fascist government, a fascist society powerful is dominating other people in society. Fascists see some people as being superior to other people. It's built into the ideology, right? And the Nazis were the prototypical and are the prototypical fascists. I had to put this over Hitler's face because, first of all, fuck Hitler and fuck the Nazis, right? Nazis are always wrong. They're always wrong. We can't allow Nazis to speak on our college campuses. We simply can't. This is known as Popper's paradox. And actually, if you look it up, you really want to learn more about it. Popper's paradox actually also applies to extreme communism as well. But Popper's paradox is the idea that fascists, if they are allowed to participate in democracy, will take over. Because a fascist doesn't care about following the rules. A fascist thinks that they are smarter than you, right? A fascist thinks that you are inferior because you are not a fascist, right? So they will try to eliminate you. They will trick you. They will lie to you. They will use tricks in their speaking. They will use propaganda in an unfair way, right? They will use hyperbole. They will use exaggeration. That's fascism, right? Now, National Socialism is the version of fascism we are probably most familiar with, right? National Socialism is a form of fascism that incorporates elements of socialism, but only for white people. Only for white people, right? That's what National Socialism is. Because take those concepts of the nation. We talked about nation earlier, right? It's a given ethnicity. Socialism, then, being that economic concept we talked about last week of using the government to provide for the needs of the people. But National Socialism specifically is using that structure to only care about a very specific type of people, of white people, right? That's not, it is not socialist, right? It is not socialist, it is fascist, right? There's a very common misunderstanding in the United States that's actually been perpetrated by people who are very similar to being fascists, that socialism and National Socialism and fascism are all the same thing. And we saw this in the 2008 presidential election, and we saw this in the 2012 presidential election, where people were comparing Obama to Hitler, where definitely Hitler would have exterminated Obama if he had a chance, right? That's definitely that's the reality. There's just a lot of confusion about that stuff. National Socialists are Nazis. I don't speak, I wish I spoke German better, but basically Nazi, it is actually more properly Nadzi. That is the German abbreviation of the National Socialist Deutschen Party, effectively. If you speak German, I apologize. Basically, that's the Nazi Party. It's an abbreviation. Anyway, so Nazis, white nationalism, alt-right, it's all the same thing. Haba. Are there any questions on that? I really want people to understand what the hell fascism is. No, we get it. That they're monsters. Don't ever talk to a fascist. You could be justified punching them in the face. Not advocating violence, but it could be justified. Now, communism. Communism, and my father, the person who's politically illiterate, thinks that communism and fascism are the same thing. They are definitely not the same thing. Communism also isn't great. Communism is a system of government in which the state controls economic production, right? So the state controls economic production. Communism is socialism without democracy as we think of it, right? So we talked about last week what socialism is, that socialists believe in giving, quote unquote, the people, whatever the people means, greater control over the means of production. Well, the way communists go about doing that is by seizing the means of production as part of the state. That's how communists do it. Communist societies strive to eliminate economic classes or economic inequality. That sounds pretty good, right? It sounds appealing. However, communism is highly susceptible to corruption. Government officials often in communist societies replace the rich as the privileged classes in those societies, right? That is kind of the dilemma of a communist society, is that they try to make it, they try to make it better for everyone, but in doing that, they take the privileges from the rich and they actually wind up just giving them to government officials. With that said, in communist societies, the lower classes, the poor, and maybe the impoverished working classes, they do often benefit from better education, better healthcare, that sort of stuff. But it's often at the expense of democracy, right? So the democracy is taken, and here's a quote from Vladimir Lenin, who, also known as Lenin, who was the first leader of the Soviet Union. And I'll break it apart for you here. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the people of transition, the period of transition to communism will for the first time create democracy for the people, for the majority, along with necessary suppression of the exploiters, of the minority, right? So, and the concept, and this is a concept critical to Leninistic communism, is that Lenin believed that there should be one person who is the dictator of the Soviet nation. And by virtue of being the dictator backed up by ideology, he can make decisions that will benefit the people. Theoretically, these are things that could make sense. I've done a fair amount of research actually, and studying the life of Lenin, and my impression of his writings and all of that is that honestly, I think he really believed it. I think he believed that this would be for the benefit of all the people. The problem is that he set up a massive hierarchy within the Soviet Union that was, as I mentioned, extremely susceptible to corruption. I honestly believe that Lenin did want to help all people in the Soviet Union, but then immediately following him came Joseph Stalin. Stalin only cared about Stalin, and he used that ideology of Lenin to prop himself up. That's my take on the early years of the Soviet Union. So the big difference between communism and fascism is that political ideology element of it. The communist believes, at least if you believe that they believe the thing, The communist believes that everyone should be treated equally, everyone should be fed, everyone should have a house, everyone should have a job, and everyone should work toward the good of the whole society. So hypothetically, it sounds pretty good. The fascist, on the other hand, believes that the strong are the ones that should be in power, and the strong are the ones who should control the government, right? They're fundamentally ideologically the opposite things, but by virtue of not being democratic societies, they wind up doing similar things. Very interesting stuff. And again, this is not stuff we often discuss in our high schools. So, any questions before we move on to the next portion? No? Okay. So, moving on. Let's look at conditions of government. Hegemony. And this word is said, listen, hegemony, right? Hedge, emony, hegemony. It's a very commonly mispronounced word. So hegemony, one definition, is the dominance of political elites based on a close, not close, but close. I'm getting tired. Dominance of political elites based on a close identification between their goals and those of the larger society. So the first definition of hegemony is the people that are in charge are seen as those who should be in charge, and through that, they're able to dominate society, right? Either rightfully or wrongfully. It can go either way. It's a phenomenon. The second definition of hegemony is the domination of one group in society by another group in society. And that's done by overwhelming consensus. And either of these definitions can lead to very real oppression, very, very real oppression. In feminist theory, when we talk about gender, there is a concept of hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is the idea that there is one version of being a man, and that version of a man is the one who should be in charge of everything, men and women. That's the concept of hegemonic masculinity. We'll talk about that more. So that's what this thing is, hegemony. If you dig in any way into women's studies, sometimes into other disciplines like Latino studies or African American studies, this concept of hegemony it's pretty important. Power elite. This section of the lecture is basically a series of somewhat disconnected ideas, largely because they don't really belong anywhere else. So the power elite are an ever-present force in modern politics. They are a relatively small number of people who control the economic, political, and military institutions of society. This concept is most closely associated with the sociologist C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills was a powerhouse of sociology in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And one of his big concepts was that there was a group within society developing, and it certainly exists in our society, that control like the whole they control the military, they control industry, they have many, many connections all around the world. And that's real. That's absolutely real. And there are those people. Former Vice President Dick Cheney is a primo example of that. There are many politicians that are primo's example of that have many, many, many connections. Now, conspiracy theorists often mistake the interactions of the power elite with each other for the fictional idea of the Illuminati. There's no such thing as the Illuminati. I don't know how to break it to people. The fact of the matter is, though, that there is a such thing as the power elite. There are people that have colossal amounts of power. And yeah, they probably can get away with most things that they want to. But the difference is between Wright's idea of the power elite and the conspiracy idea of the Illuminati is that the power elite are not all working together, right? They each have their own agendas. They are not working together. It's not a vast conspiracy, right? The Ford family is a primo example of this. So the descendants of Henry Ford. There is the Ford Corporation and the Ford Foundation. The Ford Corporation is really, really politically conservative. The Ford Foundation is very, very liberal, right? The two portions of that family can't stand each other, and they certainly couldn't conspire against each other to do anything, right? And that's the difference, right? Another way to put it is that the power elite are effectively the in-person social network of super duper rich people. And we can't keep Bill Gates from being best friends with Brad Pitt. They just might become friends, right? That's just an illustration of the power elite. It has nothing to do with the Illuminati. If you're super interested in this concept, Mills's book is actually pretty readable, and it's actually called The Power Elite, if you want to read it. Opinion leaders. Opinion leaders are another important element within modern government. Opinion leaders are high-profile people who interpret events and influence in the public. Many people use opinion leaders as substitutes for forming their own opinions and their own critical thinking. And this is an easy thing to do. And I would caution, if you watch shows that look like news shows but aren't actually news shows, because most of the time it's one person talking at you and not actually presenting stories but presenting their opinions on things. And those shows can be fun and they are entertaining. But I would, as someone trying to encourage you to use critical thinking, I would encourage you to watch more traditional news shows that try to just show you the news as it truly exists, the news as a neutral thing. I pick Rachel Maddow for this example because, quite frankly, hers is the show I would be most likely to watch of this kind, right? I agree with Rachel Maddow on most things. And if I needed advice on something in my personal life and I knew Rachel Maddow as a person, I would probably ask her advice, right? And that's kind of what people are doing when they watch these opinion leader shows, right? When we watch like Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, neither of them are really prominent anymore. It's both among Republicans and Democrats. They have these shows, right? The problem, though, is that these people, the opinion leaders, have two objectives that you don't have. First of all, they have to do a show every night, right? So every single thing that comes up, they have to have an opinion about. And I guarantee you, all of those opinions are not genuine, right? Every night, they have to get very upset about the thing, and they have to be very angry about the thing, right? They have to get really upset about this stuff. So Rachel Maddow may not give a shit about the airline industry, right? And the turbulence. Just looking at this, I have no idea what this screen grab actually did, but it gave me something to talk about, right? So I can guarantee you she is talking about the corporate corruption of the airline industry and how they're very greedy from a corporate perspective, and maybe they're discriminating against minorities, right? And I know that because I know Rachel Maddow's shtick, right? And people watch this stuff, but they're not actually getting the news. So just watch out for this stuff. Get your news from what tries to be an unbiased source. Personally, my favorite source of unbiased media is BBC News because it's foreign, right? But they talk about the United States a whole lot. So their outside perspective I actually find to be quite useful. You should have political opinions, but just don't let your news intake become politicized. Anyway, these are two more ideas, and these are important ideas in understanding our culture of the week, which is South Africa. Rebellion and revolution. A rebellion is the attempt of a group within society to force a redistribution of resources and power. Rebellions may be left-wing, they may be right-wing, they may be communist, they may be democratic, they may be fascist, right? It's just an act, it's an action, right? It doesn't depend on actual politics. Rebellions are almost always by nature violent though. We're talking about military or pseudo-military violence when we talk about rebellions. A revolution then is an attempt to overthrow an existing form of political organization and put forth another political structure in its place. A revolution may be violent, but a revolution may be nonviolent. There certainly have been many violent revolutions. There have been fewer nonviolent revolutions, but they certainly have happened. And we're actually going to look at a nonviolent revolution in South Africa in our culture of the week. However, with that said, a violent rebellion does often precede a violent revolution. But in South Africa, God, I just go with on that cadence. Oh. Anyway, South Africa, they had a violent rebellion, and then a couple decades that set the grounds for a couple decades later, and it took a long time for a nonviolent revolution, which really historically in human history has happened very, very few times. It's a really intriguing thing. Oh, there's a couple more. I thought we were going straight into South Africa. Two more things, I promise, and then we'll go and we'll take a 5-minute break just so that I can pull myself together for the last bit. Special interest groups. Special interest groups are organizations that raise money and spend money to influence elected officials and/or public opinions. Examples of special interest groups include the NRA, the National Rifle Association, right? They advocate on behalf of basically the gun manufacturing lobby. They claim to advocate on behalf of gun owners, but they've changed over the years. The tobacco lobby, so they advocate on behalf of the tobacco industry. The coal industry is also a powerful lobbying group. And then on the more progressive side, unions. Unions are also special interest groups. Professional associations are interest groups. My wife is a member of the Ohio Social Workers Association. They advocate on behalf of social workers and their clients. They are a special interest group. They have lobbyists and all that stuff. It's all mechanics that can be used. It's neither a good nor a bad thing. And then Planned Parenthood is another group that provides abortions. They also are a special interest group in maintaining that structure as being a legal structure. The point of the slide, regardless of political affiliation, special interest groups are a major part of American politics. If you are consuming media now that does include commercials for various candidates or whatever, many of those commercials are put forth not by the candidates themselves, but often by special interest groups, especially if they talk about a super specific issue. Because candidates' commercials often talk about super broad stuff, and then special interest groups, like if they were talking about how, for example, Biden wants to take your guns away, but President Trump wants to keep you having guns, that would probably be a group like the NRA or whatever, right? Because they're talking about that issue specifically. That's just one example. I can give an example for all these. Pluralism. Pluralism is a condition of political power. It's not a type of political power. It's a condition of political power, where a wide variety of individuals and groups have equal access to resources and power. It is not a type of government, it is quality of government. and there is some debate. We are certainly a democratic society, but there is debate over whether the United States is truly pluralistic, right? Do Black people have the same say as white people in our society, even though they have the same rights? That certainly could be a matter of debate. Do third parties, right? A Green Party, a Libertarian Party, do those people have any say in government on the federal level? No, they absolutely don't. So if you talk about pluralism in terms of the broad scope of political ideologies and beliefs, then no, they don't. It's an interesting idea. Okay, here's our culture of the week, South Africa. It is 7:58 according to my computer and according to my phone. I am going to start again at 8:03. Okay, do what you have to do. Okay, I got back at 8:02. After talking to my wife. Okay, it's 8:03, or almost. Anyway, though, before I really get started, is the feed better this week, or is it still choppy and nasty?
Way better.
Way better? Okay. So this is how democracy works. Democracy depends on people showing up and being present. Should I keep it like this, or should I try to transition over to Kaltera? What do you think? Any ideas there? You know the difference. Kaltera is how other people at Otterbein are doing their distance learning like this. I'm inclined to keep just doing it this way because I think I do have a better feed. If I transition over to Kaltera, I'm risking, I don't know what, the unknown of trying to use different technology halfway through the semester, basically. Anyone have opinions on that? No, not really. It is very much, it's not really a sexy kind of thing. So if anyone does have opinions on that, please let me know. If anyone's feed was just garbage tonight, please let me know. I'm probably gonna keep doing it unless someone has an opinion otherwise. Do it like this. Okay, so South Africa. Use those little thumb guys if you have them. Does anyone know anything about South Africa? Not really? No?
A little.
Who said a little? Okay, yeah, so what do you know about South Africa?
I know they've got cities there.
They what?
I said, I know they have cities there.
Oh, okay, that's a start. Yeah.
I mean, from what I when I say a little bit, I mean just like really, really little. Like,
yeah.
I mean, a lot of times people would probably think of Africa and think of the tribes.
Yeah.
And I know that they don't. It's not comprised only of tribes or broken down places, but they actually have thriving cities there that are very modern.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah. And actually, the urban areas in South Africa are actually one of the major points of contention in the history of South Africa, and certainly South Africa in the 1900s. Okay, so yeah, I've established, at least from the feedback I've got, you guys don't know much about South Africa, and that is entirely typical and okay. I find that so interesting because in the era when I was going into college, I went to college in 2001 because I'm an ancient man. In that era, colleges were talking about South Africa a lot. This was really very much the stuff of college. It was very much the stuff of political activism because everyone knew what was happening in South Africa because their revolution only really happened in the early 1990s, right? And they, yeah, that's good. I heard my kid make a sound and I slightly lost my train of thought. But yeah, so this is new change. This is like segregation falling apart in the 1990s, right? It's recent, very recent history as far as history goes. So where is South Africa? So we're not talking about Southern Africa, right? We are talking about a country called South Africa. You could call this whole area Southern Africa, if you will, right, including Madagascar. But really, we're talking about the specific country called South Africa. South Africa was colonized by the Dutch during the era of colonialization. During that era, the Dutch put white people in charge of the government because they were a colonial power. This wasn't unique. In India, the British put only white people in charge, right? In many parts of Latin America, certainly Africa, certainly many parts of Asia, the colonial powers put white people in charge. The difference is that South Africa acted as if it was still a colony for a long, long time. Even though, and I swear this picture of TV shows makes sense in a second, even though it is no longer the law, the system of laws known as apartheid in South Africa, even though it's no longer the law, the system of laws, I'm sorry, my sentence when I was drawing it up in the PowerPoint, that should make sense. That part there doesn't make any sense. Anyway, the system of laws was called apartheid. Apartheid was a system in which people were broken into 4 distinct racial groups. We're going to talk about those racial groups in a second because sociologically it's very interesting. The apartheid system, the apartheid government as it's called, started in 1948 and it ended fully in 1994. That year, 1948, is very relevant because the apartheid system, the Dutch government that was in place in the late 40s was sympathetic to the Nazis. They were. So this government was established on ideas that thought maybe the Nazis weren't so bad. And when the Nazis were fleeing Europe after World War II, most of them fled to South America, but some of them did flee to South Africa because they saw a society where only white people were in charge and they spoke a language that could be understood by someone if they spoke German. Afrikaans is the language indigenous to South Africa. It is a pidgin language actually that became a Creole, to use our vocab from earlier. It's Dutch based, but it also includes English, and there's a smattering of native African words in there, but it's mostly Dutch-ish. And by being Dutch, which is in the same family group as the English language, every once in a while when you're looking at an Afrikaans document, you'll see a word that looks like you should be able to understand it. It's just kind of the confusion of similar languages. Anyway, apartheid is Afrikaans for apartness. Apartness isn't a word in English, but apartheid is a word in South Africa. These pictures of TV shows, right? So I was struggling to come up with a show with an image of the whole scope of the apartheid government, right? It went from 1948 to 1994, right? It went from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, right? All of these TV shows existed in one way or another while apartheid existed. It was a long, long time, especially for a government in the 20th century that was fundamentally racist. Now, you can make a criticism, certainly of the United States, that we are fundamentally racist as well, but this society, the apartheid society, was deliberately and intentionally and openly fundamentally racist. So racial identity determined where you could live in South Africa. The stated goal of apartheid in the 1940s, now given they changed exactly the way they said it over the decades, but the explicit goal in the 40s was to keep Black people out of the cities so that white people could live in the cities. Often in the United States, we think of Black people as people that live in cities, and that actually is demographically kind of true. But the reality in South Africa is that they were trying to keep Black people out of cities and making cities places where white people could live specifically. If you were Black or even non-white and you wanted to go into a white area, because apartheid was different from segregation in the United States. Apartheid was about zones, right? It wasn't about not going into restaurants or not using water fountains. It was about zones of the country you could go in. So if you were a Black person and you had a reason to go into a white person zone, you had to have specific paperwork saying why you were going there, who you were going to see, what you were doing there, and when you would leave. Very similar to a situation like a modern passport. It's very much like that. And here we see these, so this, you know, grayish beige area, this is the country of South Africa. These colored areas are what are known as the Bantustan territories. The Bantu peoples, that is the native name for the Black people that lived in this part of Southern Africa, right? Before the countries, actually, the states existed. So these were intended to be very similar to similar in concept to Native American reservations, right? So and I can't see the letters well enough to really say, but if you were of this group, you could live in one of these blue areas. If you were in a yellow group, you could live in the yellow area. If you were in an orange group, you could live in an orange area. One geography note about South Africa is that this section here, the Orange Free State, the Orange Free State is its own country. It's not part of South Africa. It has its own governing structure and everything. It's its own thing. It just happens to be a country that is in the middle of South Africa. It's its own thing. Yeah, and work was the most common reason why a Black person would go into a white area. It was very common for Black people to work as basically servant jobs, so as a maid or as some sort of helper or janitor or something like that. Those were those jobs there. So, and this is where things are interesting. The four racial groups under apartheid were Black people. Black people were 76% of the population of South Africa during this era. White people were 13% of the population. Colored or Middle Eastern people were 2.8% of the population. And Indian people were 1.8% of the population. So the overwhelming majority of the population were Black. And the apartheid government specifically prohibited Black people from taking part in government, at times prohibited them from voting, and prohibiting them from going into the large cities. If you were Black, you were stuck in one of these areas, and if you were outside of one of these areas, you better have been white, right? So this whole, white people had all this area for 13% of the population. It was a gross disparity in inequality. Here we have an example of the government issued ID that this woman had. She is a member of the Xhosa, or I really am not fluent in any African language. This is her tribal name or nation name right there. On here somewhere it says her race. I do not speak Afrikaans. But each person was given their racial identity at birth, right? And what's interesting is that racial identity was thoroughly critical to your existence. And think about what that would mean to a mixed race person, right? Or someone who did not fall into the category of black, white, Middle Eastern, or Indian, right? One of those people. If you say we're from Japan, or we're from Mexico, or you were a Native American, right? All of those people don't fall into one of these classifications. But if you would take a flight to South Africa, you didn't fall into one of these classifications, they put that on your papers, and that, so they say, okay, you're Mexican, I guess that means that you're Indian. So you can go to Indian, the places that are designated for Indian people. It is not a system that was set up for diversity in any stretch of the imagination. It was a system that was set up by and for white people, effectively, and specifically white people that believed in racial supremacy. This is a note from me, the sociologist. The fact that these categories do not match our society's race categories illustrate that race is socially constructed, doesn't it? In a traditional way in the United States, if you were to ask my grandmother, for example, I actually get her to answer it, she would tell you, what are the 4 races in the United States? Well, we have white people, we have Asian people, we have black people, and I guess we have Native Americans, right? Those are the 4 most common racial groups in the United States, right? This word colored historically means black person in the United States. That's, and don't use that word, it's intense, it's racist and problematic, but it colored meant Middle Eastern in, colored meant Middle Eastern in South Africa, right? That's interesting. Indian during this era, when this identity was made in, say, this is probably the 60s, you say Indian in the United States, you're talking about an American Indian, you're talking about someone not from the country of India. But there was a substantial Indian from India population in South Africa, because remember, India's right here, right? It was pretty common for people to go back and forth between South Africa and India. And it was pretty common to go from the Middle East to South Africa. Those are people most often seeking jobs, and they were usually people with technical skills. Yeah, so major point of the slide, black people were the overwhelming majority, even though white people had the vast majority of the power. It was definitely an anti-democratic society. Black people were largely restricted to the homelands. That's what those zones, those reservations were called. They were called homelands. These were areas of the country that were specifically designated for indigenous African peoples. And this is one of those things. It sounds, I guess, like a good idea, right? Because, well, if you believe that people are better off if they just keep to themselves and they're able to govern themselves, then I guess that sounds fair. However, as we know from American history, separate is not equal, right? When you have people who are in charge of the entire government that control the vast majority of the wealth, and they're calling the shots on these other locations, we get living situations like this. This is what the homelands, sometimes called the townships, looked like in South Africa. They lacked medical facilities, they lacked natural resources, they lacked economic development, there weren't big businesses located there, not in a real way, and they lacked infrastructure. They didn't have plumbing, they didn't have roads, right? They were stuck to themselves. They were greatly exploited. All the same problems that Native American reservations have. Really, apartheid was exploitation of Native Americans combined with segregation, and you get apartheid. Really messed up system. The jobs that were present in the homelands were either mining or farming. The farmland available in the homelands was garbage. It was bad. It was not good farmland. the most useful resource in that area was mining, right? And mining is a very dangerous profession, especially if the owners are not compassionate, if they don't care, if the owner simply doesn't care about the workers, if you have a union to stand up to the workers, and it's not exactly twice as dangerous, it's just much more dangerous if workers are uneducated. And this is why. It's about the nature of the mining that took place in the homeland. So geographically, South Africa is almost a perfect storm for dangerous mining, because South Africa has the 10th largest uranium mines in the world, right? Which they're not in the top, but they're number 10 globally, right? They produce a lot of uranium, which is a very, very dangerous substance. I know this because my hometown was basically decimated with cancer because of uranium issues, because of uranium production, right? This is what uranium looks like in its natural form. It's kind of a yellowish stuff embedded with other rocks. This, like, if this rock were sitting on my desk, it isn't really dangerous just in its raw form. This is an example of uranium crystal, uranium embedded in glass. In the mid-1900s, it was actually very fashionable to have uranium-enriched glass. And if you show this stuff under a black light, it glows green. Uranium doesn't just glow green on its own. That's a common misconception. You have to put it under a black light and then it fluoresces. That's how you know it's dangerous. But this is the more common form of processed uranium, right? So if you don't know what you're looking at, the only real alarming bit of uranium is maybe that it glows visually under a black light. You don't have a black light, you don't know any better, right? This doesn't look that dangerous. It's just a yellow rock. This is somewhat processed uranium. This is actually, this gray chunk here is actually way more dangerous than this rock right here. But if you don't know that this thing, you can't smell your radiation, right? You can't taste radiation. You can't feel radiation. And if you can feel radiation, you're about to die. All of those things, to a worker that is not given any kind of education and is just told what to do, like the workers in the townships, is intensely, intensely dangerous, right? So that's one part. The other part is that in South Africa, the uranium deposits are often in the same places as the gold and the copper. So these mines are mining all of those things, right? So really, they produced way more gold and way more copper, and copper in and of itself is also a very dangerous kind of mine to be in, a very dirty kind of mine. These guys, man, and it was almost exclusively men, like the health ramifications of working in a place like this is almost unfathomable. You couldn't pay me any money to go into one of these mines. And these people were going, no, they absolutely didn't have respirators, right? They wouldn't have any kind. They were probably not wearing shirts because it was hot down there. Really, just terrible, terrible situation. Meanwhile, in the United States, I just thought this was important to bring up. This is the same era that we had segregation in the United States, right? The 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? Now, given apartheid continued into the 70s and 80s, though. So segregation was the law of the land in many parts of the United States. These areas were most densely located in the South, but also included selected restaurants, public places, and the United States military for part of that era was also segregated. I bring this up because when you look at interviews with people that participate in the apartheid government, when they're speaking English, the word they use to describe apartheid in English is segregation, right? So to them, in their understanding of it, the United States and South Africa basically did the same thing. They're different, but it's telling. It's quite telling. Anyway, though, so this is kind of the background of South Africa. Now let's talk about what the Cold War had to do with it. During the Cold War that we discussed a smidge last week, Africa was one of the major areas for proxy conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union because of the ideological basis of communism. And this is so interesting. And this is certainly not something that I would have learned in high school in the 1990s when we were just still coming out of the Cold War and quote unquote won the Cold War. Because of the ideological basis of communism, that being that all workers are equal, the Soviets sided with the anti-apartheid activists and rebels, right? So those that thought that apartheid was bad sided with the Soviet Union. However, with that said, and here's the Soviet Union right here. In the Soviet Union, xenophobia was still very common. Russia was a very racist place at that time. They still have issues with it. It should be noted, though, that the Soviets also sided with the civil rights activists in the United States, which is very interesting. And you learn that if you go through the accounts of the ongoings of the parliament within the Soviet Union. So with that said, though, the Main Street civil rights movement rejected the support of the Soviet Union, largely because the mainstream civil rights movement had a religious component to it, right? They were Christians, many of them Southern Baptist Christians, or African Methodist or something like that. The Black Panthers, on the other hand, that had a distinctly more Marxist bent, they gladly took the support from the Soviet Union. This map shows here, these are the countries allied with, these are other allies of the Soviet Union, right? And then these blue ones here, we have allies of the United States, including Saudi Arabia. And then we have, these countries are part of the Warsaw Pact. If you're familiar with what NATO is and was, NATO is a alliance of, it's a military alliance of nations, including England, France, Germany, Turkey, that were set up as a missile defense in case the Soviet Union did launch a nuclear war. Well, the opposite of NATO was the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact, these dark red nations, were ones that were lined up to be allied with the Soviet Union. So you can see that this red versus blue hodgepodge in this part of the world, it's about 50-50. And definitely, there were definitely KGB agents probably all through South Africa attempting to get South Africa to turn red. Like, that's part of the logic of the Cold War as it was. So therefore, the United States sided with the pro-apartheid government, right? They sided with apartheid, right? Now, in the 60s and 70s, during kind of the middle of the Cold War, that was kind of a, well, obviously, because, you know, they segregate their black people, we segregate our black people, we get along, right? But once the political winds changed in the United States, and we decided, hey, obvious institutionalized racism isn't okay in the United States, then it became more controversial. So Congress sided with Black South Africans, and many college campuses, activism helping South Africans went that way, and there were boycotts, and there were protests and all that. But Ronald Reagan sided with the apartheid government. He called Nelson Mandela, we'll talk more about Mandela in a second, he called him a terrorist in the media. He said that Nelson Mandela is a dangerous person, he's a dangerous rebel, he's allied with the communists, we can't allow this, as communism is the devil, therefore absolutely apartheid's great, right? And that was really, through his whole presidency, Reagan maintained that. Meanwhile, during this same era, the Taliban were labeled as freedom fighters. You know, the Taliban in Afghanistan, because they were at war with the Soviets in Afghanistan, right? And this note sums it up. The Cold War was messed up. It was seriously messed up. We were allied with some really wickedly bad places, and we were enemies to some pretty okay places. It's just, ugh. And yeah, anyway. Who were the ANC? Who was Nelson Mandela? Well, first of all, Nelson Mandela was the most prominent figure in the ANC, the African National Congress. The African National Congress were the largest and most organized group opposing the apartheid government. But very much like the civil rights movement in the United States, there were many leaders of the ANC, there were many leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, and there were many organizations other than the ANC taking part in the anti-apartheid movement. The ANC was just the biggest one, right? Actually, and they were heavily, if you look at the symbols involved in their symbolism, they were Soviet influenced though. Look, this holding of a spear, it's pretty reminiscent of what you would see in Soviet propaganda. And the spear itself is very much a nationalistic identity thing among African peoples. The spear is to medieval Africa as the sword is to medieval Europe, if you will. You also see, look at this. It looks very much like hammer and sickle. Here we have a spear here. We have a holding of a hammer, very similar to the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union. I'm not sure what this thing is. It might be an axe. It might be a mallet. I'm not sure. Note, and I found this interesting today. I never really thought about this, that this is actually a picture of a pamphlet and a picture of a button from South Africa. That stuff's in English. Isn't that interesting? I don't know. It may be, I have to look into this. It may be that between the groups, the African tribes, the Bantu tribes, it may be that when they each had their own language, but it may be that they used English as a common language and they actually used English in order to communicate more accurately with each other. I just don't know. I'd like to look into that. I'm curious. Anyway, that actually brings up another point. This whole presentation, at least the bit on South Africa, is an illustration of what you can get from a liberal education, because I took a course on South African history. That's how I know all this garbage as part of my history minor. So there you go. You're going to know all about some kind of really random crap later on, but it's useful. It's interesting, right? Okay, who were the ANC? No, this is wrong. Okay, well, this is continuing. So Reagan, when he accused them of being a terrorist organization, he actually wasn't entirely off, right? He wasn't making it up entirely. The ANC did actually commit acts that could classify as quote unquote terrorism. They could also classify as being guerrilla warfare though. They could also classify as being freedom fighters. There's an old saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That definitely is a truism when it comes to understanding the ANC. During the 1960s and 70s, if you look into documents and news reports from that era, there were many groups globally that were doing terrorist sort of tactics globally. Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland is one such organization. If you know anything about the time that was called the Troubles in Northern Ireland, that were signified by car bombings, military actions, that sort of thing. What Sinn Féin did in Northern Ireland was far more than what the ANC did in South Africa. And Sinn Féin is actually a mainstream political party today in Northern Ireland. The Baader Meinhof gang, Baader might be misspelled, it might just be 1A, I'm not sure. Anyway, the Baader Meinhof gang were a group of avowed communists in Germany, in West Germany during this era. Remember, during this era, East and West Germany were two different countries. West Germany was the Americanized version of it. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, also known as the PLO, they also were doing pseudo-terroristic things. The Black Panthers were not above using military force for achieving what they needed to get done. And then a group that was way more terrorist than the Panthers, the Weather Underground, also existing in the United States. They were a group of so-called freedom fighters in the United States. They bombed stuff in the United States. They did bank robberies. Like, they were a full-blown, like, criminal enterprise in the United States, but they did that for political reasons. During the 60s and 70s, it was seen as a potential avenue to create social change to actually use violence. That was a thing. That was part of the political discourse. Did most people think it was very bad? Yeah, they did. They absolutely did. But some of these organizations were imprisoned. Some of them faded away. That's what happened with the Weather Underground. They just kind of went away. And some of them were killed, right? The Black Panthers were effectively assassinated out of existence. Those groups that call themselves the Black Panthers today, they aren't the same group. Anyway, though, others, though, like the PLO, like Sinn Féin, they became mainstream political organizations, and it was actually an avenue for social change for them. And that's interesting. It's interesting. Now, it was not until the late 1990s in the United States terrorism started to be seen as incredibly dangerous in the eyes of the American public, right? And I find this aspect of my childhood fascinating. This is straight up real. Every year, somebody in my hometown on Chinese New Year made a call to the high school saying there was a bomb in the building. Every single year. And we all knew it was coming. We all knew bomb day was coming. It's Chinese New Year. We marked it down. We knew we wouldn't have a full day of school. Yeah, we'll walk down the churches, then we'll get bused home. No big deal, right? That's insane. That I promise you, that same school does not do that anymore. But like, we just didn't take it seriously, because if bombs did explode, which they very rarely did, they were like a hand grenade, right? They were like maybe a stick of dynamite. They were not a whole building, right? Terrorism really kind of upped itself in the late 90s to become something else. And the major turning point for that was the Oklahoma City bombing on April 19th, 1995. That's when an anti-Semitic white supremacist detonated a massive fertilizer bomb outside of the Oklahoma Federal Building in an attempt to spark a race war. In that explosion, you can see he blew up half of the building, sent debris through most of downtown Oklahoma City. He killed 168 people. 680 people were injured. It also destroyed a child care center where 19 children under the age of 6 were killed, right? That was the Oklahoma City bombing. That was really the point in the United States when we started actually trying to stop that stuff. And because it was a major attack, right? and innocent people were hurt. Prior to this, these dumb bomb threats and that sort of thing, as I said, very, very small. And they were most typically like banks or maybe police stations or something like that. It wasn't childcare centers, right? It was kind of a different kind of thing. Should we have been expecting that kind of stuff, doing that thing in the 80s and just like, you know, kind of wandering away from the school, no big deal? No, that was really dumb. But that sometimes social change happens for a good reason. Similarly, everyone that was in my hometown at that time, we're pretty sure we know who was doing it too. That's the thing. And like, yeah, I don't know, man. That guy. Anyway. So, Mandela's terrorist activity. I spelled Mandela wrong there. Mandela only has one L. Mandela's quote-unquote terrorist activity occurred after what was called the Sharpsville Massacre in 1960. And this link is a really good explanation of why Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist. He was actually on a terrorist watch list until 2008 by the FBI, even though it was purely for political reasons. So the Sharpsville Massacre occurred. Sharpsville is a small city outside of Johannesburg. Johannesburg is the capital of South Africa. 69 Black protesters were killed. No police were killed in that massacre. This massacre created widespread protests across South Africa. The apartheid government, in response to these mass protests, banned the ANC. They said, enough is enough. The ANC is now an illegal organization. As a result, the ANC goes underground. Mandela became the head of the military wing of the ANC called Umkhonto we Sizwe. Again, I didn't say that right, I'm sure. That is the Spear of the Nation, they called themselves, right? That's the name of their militaristic organization. This right here, the ANC going underground, because they were activists first, right? This right here is why you do not make any organization illegal, right? Because when you make an organization illegal, it goes underground. And once an organization becomes illegal and underground, it's a very small step over into a war, right? An internal civil war. That's why you don't make political organizations illegal. Mandela described his actions during this era as being small-scale guerrilla warfare. He also said that the armed struggle was forced on us by the government. By driving them underground, by saying you can't do that, you can't do that peacefully, they basically put the guns in their hands effectively. And those guns, in all likelihood, were being supplied by the Soviet Union. That's how it worked. This occurred in 1960. In 1964, Mandela was convicted of sabotage and treason. As a result of that, he was put in prison until the year 1990, right? So he was in prison there for 36 years. Other leaders of the ANC were also being held in prison at that time. So they were in prison for a very long time as a result of this. During his time in prison, it should say their time in prison, there were many leaders other than Mandela that were also in there. All of their communications were heavily censored, right? They sent letters out on, they wouldn't give them writing paper, so they had to write their letters on toilet paper and smuggle it out, their communication to the activists on the outside. Additionally, in addition to smuggling letters out, and this prison was called Robben Island. It was very much an Alcatraz type of island off the southern coast of South Africa. They actually engaged in civil disobedience when they were in the prison, right? That's a big deal. That takes a lot of coordination, a lot of willpower. It's much, much stronger. It's a much, much different thing than engaging in civil disobedience out in public, right? Because modern civil disobedience, you can lay down in the road and wait for the police to come arrest you, and that's one thing, and they might rough you up a little bit. In prison, they don't have to even pretend to not be violent. They can just start with punches and beatings, right? They don't have to even ramp up, right? So Mandela's struggle in prison with his allies, that it was a totally real thing. This is actually this is a picture specifically from Amnesty International. Amnesty International as an organization did exist independent of Nelson Mandela, but one of the major accomplishments of that organization is that they did put a heavy influence from the Western world onto Nelson Mandela and their fights. Their working with Mandela was one of the major circumstances of creating them as a big international organization. And also during this time, as I indicated, I didn't say, Mandela became an iconic symbol of the struggle, right? Effectively, he became a martyr without dying, right? In a really interesting way. So in 1990, this effectively what was a nonviolent revolution occurred in South Africa. Basically, the international boycotts, the international pressure from Mandela's writings internationally and his doing civil disobedience in the prisons and activism that was being guided by Mandela and his allies in South Africa finally pushed President F.W. de Klerk's into putting change into motion in basically disentangling the South Africa, the apartheid regime out of the South African government, right? Apartheid was an integral part of the government, though. The South African government was apartheid. Imagine if segregation was like half of the content of the Bill of Rights, right? That's really what was happening in South Africa. So they had to completely redo that constitution. In 1990, the apartheid government lifted the ban on the ANC. So the ANC became a legal organization then, right? So they could do their activism above ground. They didn't just have to call it an anti-racist rally, they could actually call it an ANC rally again. Additionally, the president lifted the remaining apartheid laws and he repealed those. With that said, de Klerk was not he was not in political agreement with Mandela. They did not have the same politics, but they both felt that apartheid was bad, right? That's a pretty important point to make. So in terms of American politics, you could say that Mandela was a certain type of progressive and de Klerk was definitely a type of conservative. In 1994, which was the next election after 1990, the ANC won many of the seats in the first non-racist elections in South Africa. If I remember correctly, Black people did have limited voting rights, but they didn't have full voting rights during South Africa under apartheid. In 94, that was the first fully democratic elections in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was elected president. He was the first Black president of that country, which is wild, right? We have a country with 74% Black population. The United States has a 12% Black population, and Mandela was in '94 the first Black president of that country. In 1995, Mandela established what came to be known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then in '96, Mandela oversees a new constitution for South Africa, and he laid the foundations for a new government, thus free of apartheid. So they rewrote the constitution, they undid apartheid, and they made it effectively so anyone could go anywhere in South Africa as long as they were South African citizens, right? It's a big deal. Now, in 1995, this thing, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a very interesting thing. I have a minor in peace studies, which sounds like a hippy-dippy load of garbage, but peace studies is all about trying to find a nonviolent resolution to tough situations, right? And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is something we spent a lot of time studying. Hooray, liberal arts. This restorative justice judicial body conducted investigations and trials into the abuses that took place during the apartheid regime, right? So this isn't like an investigation of a court in the United States, though, because they weren't there to punish people. That's not what they were trying to do. They were trying to get to the bottom of understanding what happened during apartheid and telling the stories of apartheid, right? And documenting it for history's sake, right? Because it was a 60-year time frame. You couldn't possibly punish everyone who took place in the apartheid government. If people were found to be unjustly punished, if, say, a white person unfairly took away the farm of a Black person, and there was a way to give that farm back to a Black person and still making it so that that white person could also live their lives, they did fixes like that, right? Or if a Black person was put in prison because they were an activist, they got those people released, right? Releasing people from prison was one of the most common reconciliation actions that they did, actually. The commission ended its work in the year 2000, so it was a 5-year thing. Then it established what became known as the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. So the whole trials section of it went on for about 5 years. And now, and it's still continuing 20 years later, and there's a link there if you're interested. The Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, they work to, one part of it is documenting what happened during apartheid and really the horrors of apartheid, but they're also an international organization that tries to document things that happen all over the world. So they're a really interesting organization in that regard. Okay, that is the end of what I have for the evening. Are there any questions or issues to address before we are done being together for the week?
Well, just to clarify,
Sure.
from before, a band is like a group of people related by blood?
A band?
Yeah.
Yeah, a band is a group of people, most typically related by blood. I think I might see what you're asking. If you're looking at the essay, your band in your essay doesn't necessarily have to be purely related by blood, but bands are typically large families, though, over time, but not always. That's a better definition. Good question, Ava.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Anything else? No? Don't see any objections? Okay, guys. So I think that calls it good for us for the evening. If you run into any technical difficulties, if you have any questions, please send me an email. I do intend on getting caught up on my email by sometime tomorrow afternoon. Yeah, keep wearing those masks in public. Please stay well. We are expected to see an uptick in October and November of COVID cases, so please don't be one of those people. Stay well. See you later.
I did have one question.
Yeah, sure.
I sent an email where I was having a little bit of trouble with the quiz.
Uh-huh. I think I might have seen your email. What happened? You still there?
It just didn't, yeah. It didn't pause when I looked at it, and I wanted to go back and review the lecture slides.
Uh-huh.
And so when I went back to answer the questions, like 10 minutes later, it was telling me I was out of time.
Were you able to actually do it?
It looks like it took the answers.
Yeah.
But I wasn't sure.
It probably did. I will give you credit for that. Yeah, that's a tricky bit. Basically what happens is the timer is based in the cloud. It's not based on your computer. But yeah, with that kind of stuff, just let me know, and yeah, you'll be fine. You'll be good. Don't worry about it. And if you're not, I'll let you know.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. See you later.
Have a good night.
You too.
Jeremy, I have a quick question.
Sure, Ben. What's up?
How does communism in China differ from what was in the Soviet Union or
Oh, wow. Well, oh lordy. Okay, so if you really want to read into it, the big difference is that communism in the Soviet Union became what was known as Stalinism, and communism in China became what was called Maoism. So it was the difference between those two leaders, right? Chairman Mao and Joseph Stalin. Now, in modern China, the big difference is that the Chinese government has let go of a lot of that state domination of the economy. They've really let go of most of the socialism really to it. And that's why iPods are made in China, right? Is because they've kind of embraced capitalism, but also still keeping that totalitarian stuff. Yeah, it's the short answer is it's super duper different. The big thing is that they've kind of given up on controlling the entire economy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I was thinking about how that they have that really super wealthy guy who does the competitor to Amazon thing, and and how they don't like redistribute the wealth of the top 1% there or whatever to the rest of the people. So I thought that communism still.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not really is the answer. The weird thing, but with that said, they do tax pretty heavily. So in doing that, they do still provide a lot of social services. You know, there are some very interesting things that happen in China. It's not this big evil dictatorship. It's also not someplace I'd probably like to live. It's interesting, really interesting. Yeah.
All right. Thanks. Have a good week.
See you later.
See ya.